Through Kristen, I'm the Community Engagement Manager for OOI, and we're delighted to have you here. Thank you for coming. And this is the first kickoff of our series of virtual sessions at AGU for our OOI's booth. For Delisa Clough, who will introduce this session, but really check out oceanobservatories.org and sign up for more. Thank you. Lisa?
Great. Thanks, Darlene, and thanks to everyone for being here today. Our topic for today's inaugural session for AGU 21 is the Pioneer Move. I want to say a special thanks to some folks from the facility, actually everyone from the facility, but Al and Derek, who you're going to hear from, John Trowbridge, lead scientist for the OOI facility, Darlene Chris have been just phenomenal in getting the Pioneer Move on everyone's radar screen and supporting all the work that has been done and all the work that's going to be done in the future to make this a reality. I want to thank, we have an OOI facility board, and in particular, Kendra Daly and Annette De Silva have just been instrumental in getting the Pioneer Move activities to happen. We had the wonderful innovation folks, so no innovation. Sounds bad, but KNOW innovation or KI were great with facilitating some innovation labs that Al will briefly tell you about. And some of you guys on the call were participants or panelists. Also, huge thanks to you guys for making all of those steps happen. So we've had a small army of people involved since we checked in with you guys at AGU 2020, I think, to tease you about the Pioneer Move. And it's really been just a great process. I want to give just a little bit of history, and in case we have some folks who haven't been as involved. NSF, so our organization's intention were always to have the Pioneer Array move. Pioneer, kind of the explorer, as it were, and we actually said, I think way back when, that maybe we'd move it every 3 to 5 years. We have learned for many things that NSF sometimes stands for not so fast, and really moving an array of this size in a facility of this complexity needs to take some time. So in OOI, what we refer to as OOI 1.0, which is sort of the period of the Oceans Observatories Initiative where we were moving from construction to operations, there was a lot going on. And so we made the decision to not start the clock on that 3 to 5 year period until we started OOI 2.0. So OOI 2.0 really, under the leadership of Woods Hole, we were pretty confident that we knew what we were doing operations-wise, so it was time to tackle the potential to have our original intentions of the Pioneer Move to be executed. And Al and Derek, Darlene and John, I think you started, well, if we announced it a year ago, it was probably 2 years ago that we actually started having our conversations about how we were going to do that. And sort of the obvious question is the where, but you know, that was not, how do we get consensus from the community? How do we sort of do things in a manner that we're really going to get us to the right location, and then once we had the location fixed, where will we get what this discussions that needed to be had about what was the initial optimization, things like that, how were we going to get all of that explored. So we wound up with our innovation lab process. I think that was really beneficial. We could have gone a standard request for proposals like we had done previously, but I think we we learned some great things throughout the process, and we're excited. You guys already know that we're migrating the array south. So she is going to be in the Southern Mid-Atlantic Bight. And I think with that, we're happy to answer questions at the end, but I'm going to turn it over to Al to provide a lot more of the details. But again, huge thanks to all of you guys on the call, everybody who's made this happen. And it's really exciting times for science in general, for OOI in particular, and for the first move of the Pioneer Array.
Thanks, thanks, Lisa. I think I can take it from there. Let me share my screen, so bear with me for a moment. Hopefully it's up. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to give you a brief kind of status report and a bit of a look ahead as to how we're going to do this relocation. First, a little bit of background. Lisa alluded to some of this. The announcement was indeed, I think, February 2020 at Ocean Sciences that there would be an intention to relocate. The community input from 2 of those innovations labs, March and June of this year, that represented many tens, if I don't know, probably pushing 100 different individuals that provided input there. And as noted, the decision to relocate to the Southern MAB was announced in April 2021, and that led to actually following the second lab in June. So in July, we kind of started in earnest the kind of the OOI part of this relocation process, or the the implementation of what was discussed at these innovations labs. So what's the big picture look ahead? The timeline is shown here. We're envisioning 3 main phases for this. Planning phase, which is where we are now, then kind of engineering and design, followed by implementation. So it's going to be a long process, something like more than 30 months is what this works out to when we went through the timeline. And this is obviously a very simplified version of a much more detailed working document that we have with the timeline and the plan. The basic idea of the phases, so phase 1, we're in now. I'll tell you more about this because we know more of the details. We're going to consolidate the input from those innovations lab. We need to do environmental assessment, regulatory work, permitting, preparation, some engineering assessments, and we're talking about a regulatory study being done. Then with that input, we're ready to go into kind of the more in earnest engineering and design, because now we know what it is we need to design. That'll be mooring design, site layout, details, instrumentation, and that sort of thing. That will set us up to have an actual implementation and design plan, which we can then execute in phase 3. And that involves regulatory approval process, permits, for example, that we will need, and other water space management issues. Have to procure various items, perhaps some instrumentation, maybe some equipment for moorings, build the moorings, design, test, integrate, prepare for deployment. So that's the big picture plan. In order to have time, and in fact, in order to have funding for all that work, the current Pioneer Array is not going to be able to operate continuously through this period. And in fact, the plan is for the New England Shelf Pioneer to be recovered in the fall of 2022. We still have work to do after that comes home, obviously, refurbish equipment, calibrate instrumentation, et cetera, but we will not be preparing it. We will not be redeploying the Pioneer Array in the New England Shelf and again after fall 2022. So we look ahead for the April 2024 deployment in the Southern MAB. So as I said, there's a more detailed timeline. I'm not going to show you that, but I'm going to show you this one, which is a little more detailed than the previous one. There's still too much here to go through, but I just want to make 2 main points on this slide. One is what the input is. So over here in the upper left, this workflow starts with the innovations lab. We are implementing the science themes and questions, the location, the mooring, notional mooring designs, the operation area, the mobile asset concepts, instrumentation. That's all coming from the input from you all, from the community, from the innovations lab. So we are implementing that plan. We are not making up the plan as we go to suit our needs. We're trying to suit the needs of the community as expressed in the innovations lab. The second point I want to make is look at 3 milestones in this process. So here's preliminary system design at the end of phase 1, spring of 2022. Intermediate design, about summer of 2022, partway through the phase 2. And finally, the final design here. I got to change something on my screen, sorry. Final design here at the end of phase 2. So at each point, these kind of milestone are associated with reporting and feedback. So reporting will be lots of internal reporting in the program, also outward looking reporting like we're doing here today to the community, and input from all those groups that we talked to, and in particular from a focus group, a Pioneer Relocation focus group that I'll tell you about in a minute. So we have a plan in place and a variety of mechanisms in place for reporting and statusing and feedback. So let's look a little more detail in phase 1, the planning phase. How are we doing? What's the status? Our first goal that we started in July or so, as I said, is to consolidate the Innovations Lab input. We have started this through the establishment of this focus group, which I'll describe, and we're really planning to go through this stage following the structure of the Innovations Lab pretty much identically. So we're going to go through science themes, array design, and instrumentation, which are kind of the 3 main areas that were dealt with in those Innovations Lab, and from which we have voluminous input available to us. Basically, everything that was ever said or done at that lab is available in just hundreds and hundreds of pages of input. So we've got what we need for raw materials. We need to do a site characterization. This is something we did for WHOI 1.0 for the New England Shelf Array. Think of this as characterizing the condition like the surface waves, wind speed, wave heights, currents in the water column, seabed cables, shipping lanes, wind farms. We need to understand this site, and that is a research problem at some level. And so we've established a group to start working on that and pulling together available information on the site. And I'll tell you a little more about that on the following slides, as well as the regulatory study. I tend to use different words for this, and I apologize. It's regulatory study or environmental compliance, permitting, water space management. It's kind of all in this category. And we have a RFQ, request for quotes, or RFP, request for proposals, basically in process to engage a consultant to help us with this. And finally, this will all lead to the engineering assessment, which we need to get on pretty quickly in 2022. So I talked about the focus group. What is this? It's an ad hoc group. It's a volunteer group, and we're looking for input on our plans as they evolve. Our goal is to stay pretty true to the Innovations Lab and to the community requests. And so we want to have some checks and balances, make sure we don't go off the rails with a strictly internal process. The goal, there's kind of 2 areas that we'll work with these people on. One is occasional targeted email inquiries to these SMEs or subject matter experts. Some of you, I think, may be on this call listening, and I appreciate, we've already started pinging people by email. Appreciate your help and your input. What we are looking for in a more formal way from this group is 3 virtual meetings, and they're going to match the timing of those workflow milestones that I just described. They'll be fairly short and concise, a couple hours, half a day at the most for each meeting. And we're going to review our status and seek input on how we're doing and how things are going. It's an 8-member group. They're all familiar with WHOI. They're familiar with the Pioneer Array in its current location. So they won't have a big learning curve to answer some of our questions. They span early career to senior scientists, multiple disciplines, and really trying to have expertise that spans the range of science questions that were presented at the Innovations Lab. So one of the first things we need to do is kind of come up with the overarching science themes. As we talked about, the Innovations Lab input was excellent, but also voluminous, and hundreds of science questions, hundreds of ideas. We need to kind of consolidate this and bring it under some big umbrella themes And we started to do that. It looks to me that the appropriate themes are something like what I've shown here. First of all, the dynamics of shelf slope exchange. That's mostly the physical processes. It sounds a lot like the New England Shelf Pioneer high level theme, right? But the processes are different at this different location. The next theme might be called ecosystem response to biogeochemical cycling and transport. This is kind of where the physics and the biology get linked, right? So biology, chemistry linked to the physical processes. And then there's an overlay on these. You could say it's encompassed in both of those first two bullets, but there's a particular desire to be able to capture extreme events like hurricanes or say freshwater outflows from Chesapeake Bay is an example that was given. So with these themes are what drive the array design, right? So the science drives the array design. And what we really want to do here is take these highly ranked kind of science goals or science themes and assess them and refine them so that they're implementable. So our goal is to look through what we've got, make sure we can address the science questions, but we've got to optimize the use of what we have, our existing inventory of equipment. I'll show you that at a high level in a minute. It's got to be feasible to implement. It can't be too complex, too costly. We do have to operate within our existing budget. So there's not new money to completely revamp the array from the ground up, for example. It's more a, well, relocation, right? To the first order, we're relocating the array, not rebuilding the array. So what is it that we have to relocate? The key array elements are here. We have what we call CSMs, coastal surface moorings. Those tend to be good at measuring air-sea interaction and the upper 10 meters or so of the water column, as well as near bottom, a meter or so above the sea floor. CPMs, coastal profiler moorings, they're well suited to measuring the mid-water column between about 25 meters below the surface and 25 meters above the bottom, roughly. And they work really nicely together. The CPMs and CSMs make a nice pair. You can get near surface to near bottom, nearly continuous coverage if you merge those two data sets. We also need to put some moorings in shallow water. These moorings were designed for about 100 to 600 meters water depth, but the request is for moorings in 25, 30 to 50 meters water depth, something like that. These designs won't really work, so we need to rethink it a little bit. We have gliders with track lines that are to be determined really at this point. We'll have to work through that based on the Innovations Lab input. And 2 autonomous vehicles, propeller-driven vehicles that will also track lines TBD, but it's likely that these vehicles will run missions in the near proximity to the moored array, kind of filling in the gaps in the moored array in a manner similar to what we do for the New England Shelf Array. So these elements come together in a proposed array design. I think you're probably aware, most of you on this call, that the region of interest is offshore of North Carolina and north of Cape Hatteras. So roughly in that red box that you see there is kind of the primary focus area. That's what we're considering the mooring box. The white circles are the notional mooring locations. I'll show you that in close up in a minute. So the moorings span the shelf and the slope, focused on the shelf break. They're roughly centered east of Nags Head, North Carolina. That will be supplemented by gliders and AUVs that will operate potentially in a larger area. They'll also focus on the shelf, but may go somewhat further offshore and may also extend to the north, perhaps as far north as Norfolk Canyon, as per some of the desire for interesting science that could be done in that area. So let's move one step more detail into the moored array. Here's the components we envision. And I want to emphasize this is preliminary design. Moorings may not be exactly where these dots are, and they may not be the exact type and number that you see here, but this is a notional design that is, we think, plausible, implementable, and kind of appropriate to the scale and budget that we have available. So there would be 3 of these surface moorings, 5 profiler moorings, and 2 of the new TBD shallow water moorings. You can see in the key to the to the figure here in the upper left. The surface moorings are green, profiler moorings, triangles, and the shallow moorings, the squares. And the idea is to create a sort of T-shaped array. Along the slope, you see a line along roughly the 100-meter isobath where we have these surface mooring, profiler mooring pairs. Then further offshore at about 600 meters depth are solo profiler moorings to get some information further offshore. And then the rest of the T is created by two of these shallow water moorings. The scales here, these lines are about 20 kilometers long. The scales of separation are between 15 and 25 kilometers. We think, again, that's a reasonable starting point. That may also, that's one of the things that may be refined as we go. We may decide the spacing needs to be a little different. We may also come up against various obstacles, water space management issues, shipping lanes, submarine cables, what have you, that could shift some of these locations around. So that's a good segue to the challenges. There's regulatory / permitting / water space management challenges. There's a really neat set of slides where you take this figure and you click through, and Derek has done a lot of this work, and you overlay the different water space users on top of this, and you realize that there isn't nearly as much open space as you think in order to just put your moorings wherever you want. We have a challenge of developing these shallow water moorings, which I described, and we're working on that, and we'll entrain first some ideas and brainstorming, and then we'll go to legitimate, mooring engineers who will do design studies and performance studies based on water currents and waves and wind that we provide. And finally, we would like to instrument this array a little bit differently than the current Pioneer array, and that's another challenge. And I think, if I remember, my next slide goes into that. Right, so let's dig a little bit into instruments. I counted 36 different instruments or measurement concepts coming out of the Innovations Lab. It's great, right? That's really awesome. It's also not something we can do is add 36 new instrument types. So they've got to be prioritized, obviously. And the way we're going to go through this is think about matching to the science themes. We also need to ensure that these instruments have a level of technical readiness. In other words, there's a established vendor that can supply and refurbish these instruments. Even if those first two are met, they have to have certain level of operational feasibility based on the array design. There could be size constraints or power constraints for battery-powered instruments, for example, battery-powered platforms that might make an otherwise good instrument not really feasible. And finally, as I alluded to, we're in a flat budget space here. So there's going to have to be some kind of trade space. If we're adding things, we may have to remove things, for example, in order to have a net zero impact on the budget. So how are we going to get there? I suggest this is somewhat of will be a challenge for us. We'll start with an internal assessment by WHOI. We'll reach out to subject matter experts. We'll ask the vendors as warranted. We'll get input from this focus group that I described. And once we settle on presumably a handful of new instrumentation that we can actually implement, we'll go through RFP and formal procurement process, which is required for this program. We have to go through the normal government procurement procedures. So let's see, we're moving on kind of from this consolidation effort to some of the other things that have to happen in parallel. We need to do a site characterization. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. This will be done mostly internal by the OOI team. We have support from some WHOI tech staff. We've actually started on this already. We have an outline and work is happening as we speak, I think. We expect this to be kind of a living document. There'll be multiple iterations as we get existing data. We get input from our regulatory studies suggesting other information we may need. The information we get could feed back to a different mooring array and layout, which would then circle back around to needing slightly different environmental information. So this will take a while. It will live all the way through, I think, to the implementation phase. We'll be working on the site characterization. I talked about environmental compliance. It has a pretty broad scope: permitting, regulatory, water space, each of those is pretty complex on its own. The way we want to get started on that is to do what we're calling a regulatory study, which will be like a desktop study. In other words, an informational study that will outline the process that we need to follow. So we don't want to just jump into this process and stumble along the way. We want to have a real good feel for exactly what we need to do, what agencies are involved, what the timelines are likely to be for different permits, and then start through it that way. And we think the best way to do this is with an outside consultant. And so we have this request for quotes to start this study, and we expect to select a consultant by probably the end of January or early 2022. And because this is a sort of paper study, desktop study, if we get the right consultant, we think this can be done pretty quickly, just a few months, and then get us into the actual permitting process. Throughout this whole process, obviously, we have to do outreach and communication. I kind of think of this list separated into two types. That the first two major bullets are things we kind of have to do internal to the program. We need to look for science opportunities, develop partnerships, find collaborators, and we're actually already underway with a lot of that. We need to worry about water space management. We've got to talk to fishers. We've got to talk to the Coast Guard, the Navy, the wind farm operators, et cetera, to make sure that we have our water space users in good stead. And then the second two major bullets are more kind of the outward looking aspects of this. You can expect information to show up on the OOI website, the OOI newsletter, various social media postings. If you were really watching closely, you would have seen a couple already. I think the decision to move to Southern MAB was posted soon after that initial decision. And then most recently in, I think, September, we posted the timeline that I showed you earlier. And I think we're getting close to probably going public with a preliminary array design similar to what I showed you a few slides before. We're not just going to do it by a remote control with postings. We're also going to be talking to people directly. Updates like this one, time for question and answer. We'll go to national meetings, AGU, Ocean Sciences, and we'll go to regional meetings. We intend to go to the IUCE providers such as Syracuse and Makura. We've already started some dialogues with them. The MABPOM meeting, for those of you who know about that, is an excellent venue, and we'll certainly be there talking to people as well. So I think that's kind of where I'm at. To summarize, I hope I gave you the impression that this relocation is a pretty long, complex process. At the same time, we have a pretty good plan in place. We kind of know what the steps need to be. We're executing it, and we're pretty much on schedule. And as we go through it, we look for your input and feedback and discussion, which I think we have plenty of time for. So if there are questions, Derek, myself, or Lisa can probably answer most of them, hopefully. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Al. We're trying to make this as interactive as possible, and I have a list of everyone's names. So if you have a question, raise your hand and I'll unmute you so you can actually address whoever you'd like to answer the question. And I think we may have been a bit remiss. Derek Buffitt is here. He is the project manager for the coastal and global scale nodes and responsible for a lot of this for the Pioneer Array. So if someone has a question, please raise their hand. Short of that, put in the chat, Darlene, I'd like to speak. There's somebody. I don't see anyone with raised hands. There you go, John Trowbridge. Can you expand on the high-level science themes? What will we learn about shelf-ocean exchange?
Yeah, there's a lot behind the curtain, obviously. I think there are some unique processes in this area. I alluded to some of them. The Gulf Stream influence, the kind of recirculation zone, the shelf break processes themselves, the likelihood of streamers and other kind of strong intermittent offshore, onshore flows, the outflows of fresh water from near coastal region, impacts from strong storms and high wave conditions. So there were, I don't know, it's not all about the numbers, but there were, I think, 23 of the, I said there were hundreds, like over 100 science concepts, themes, questions. There were 23 kind of highly ranked by the group, and those form the basis of those themes. So if you dig under those themes, you'll find tens of specific questions that were raised by the Innovations Lab participants.
Thank you, Al. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Cool. My name's Dan and I represent RBR. So we're an industry partner, and I'm most familiar with the Endurance Array out on the West Coast, but I was just curious, in the stages that you discussed today, obviously it sounds like the Innovations Lab and the focus groups perhaps have been formulated, but how would you or the OOI like industry partners to get involved to make sure that you're most familiar with what's available in terms of updating instrumentation and things like that? What would be your recommended way to get involved from this point forward?
Yeah, when we get, thanks, Dan, that's a good comment. When we transition, right about the transition from phase 1 to phase 2, I think we are going to have a kind of vetted list of plausible instrument measurement concepts that we think are workable and implementable. And at that point, I think we're going to do 2 or 3 things simultaneously. We're going to go out to subject matter experts, some of which will be found on that focus group, some which might not be, from the science community, get their input. And we will also be going out to vendors with RFIs, probably. I don't know, Derek, you might comment there, but requests, some formal requests for feedback that will be related to requirements at some level. This instrument needs to do this and this and this. So that that's the way I kind of see the industry getting involved. Do you have further thoughts on that, Derek?
Well, I think you're right, Al. The very first step we're probably going to do to engage commercial vendors or industry is the RFI process. So in that RFI, we'll have science requirements, we'll have mechanical, electrical requirements, and as much information as can be provided in those responses to the RFIs helps us best understand what's available, what the technical readiness of that instrumentation is, so that we can make the best decision possible. And depending on what we get back from those RFIs, we may extend the process to include face-to-face discussions. Depending on the schedule, we may ask for example instruments for inspection and testing. But the very first step is going to be an RFI and basically a desktop study of the information from individual vendors.
Thank you both. That's great. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. Glenn, you're up.
Al, I'm really curious about fishing activity in the area. What steps are you going to take to build connections to the fishing industry?
Yeah, we're worried about it too, obviously. We talked a little bit to the IUS regional organization leads about this just recently, and I thought their answer was quite revealing. So I asked the kind of leading question, like which 2 groups should we talk to in order to get the high level overview of the commercial fishing and their stakeholder interests? And the answer essentially was, yeah, it doesn't work that way. You need to find the individual people. They're not a well-organized group. You need to get out and start conversations and build trust with small, multiple groups of interested people. So I think that probably sounds pretty familiar to you, Glenn. It's kind of the way we started with New England Shelf Pioneers. We thought there would be sort of a sweeping go to these two meetings, talk to these two groups and figure it out. And it really was more like start digging under the rocks and looking in the nooks and crannies and trying to reach out to eventually get to very small groups and or individuals and try to get their trust and get them to help you integrate with the rest of the community. So long and difficult process, I think.
Yeah, and Mike Muglia at the Coastal Studies Institute has had a lot of interactions with the local fishing community down there. He's part of the Peach team. So he's definitely someone worth talking to.
That's great. We'll get that name on our list.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Al mentioned commercial fisheries. I think there's potentially a larger impact from recreational fisheries in that area than what we're facing right now in the New England shelf as well. So I think we're going to be following the same process to try to get some of these recreational fishermen involved as well.
Excellent point, Derek. I totally agree on that.
Are you good, Glenn?
Absolutely good.
Thank you. The next question is from Susan Banahan. Has the new proposed instrumentation been identified?
Short answer is, I'm not quite sure the question you're asking. You're asking the candidate instrumentation is identified. We have a list that we've worked through from the Innovations Lab. It's sort of just between Derek and I, at the moment, but we will go out. Once we get that a little more mature, we'll be going out to the focus group and to other SMEs and to everyone, and anyone we can think of who can help us sift through that. So the candidates have been identified through the Innovations Lab process. The actual instruments to be deployed, we're quite a long ways away, honestly, from that. We've got a lot of triage and prioritization to do before we're at that point. I'm not sure. Did I answer your question? By the way, hi, Sue. Good to
Hi, Al. Well, I guess I was asking not specific instrumentation, but types. I mean, are there new types that haven't been deployed on OOI before?
Right.
That would be a totally new type outside the current types of instrumentation that are deployed.
Yes, that is correct. And I'll probably do a disservice to all the ones that were mentioned if I try to do it from memory, but the ones that pop to mind are the like a flow cytobot type instrument, right? That would give you imagery of populations, turbidity type of instrumentation that would have more input as towards particulate matter in the water column, and some other like DNA sensors, water column DNA, for example, was mentioned. And again, I'm not doing a good job off the top of my head, but there were half a dozen very new to OOI instruments that were mentioned. They may not all be practical and feasible, right? So I don't want to get everybody's hopes up too high, but we will work to do what we can with the recommendations we were given.
Yeah, some others were passive hydrophones for mammal tracking,
Right.
Fish tag tracking, methane sensors. But as Al said, we have to go through, the power budget of the moorings. We have to go through the technical readiness of each of these types of sensors and see where we are, because any new sensor that we add is a budget impact and an engineering impact, and they all have to be weighed against each other.
Does that do it for you, Susan?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Gordon, you're up.
Thank you. Yeah, hi, Al and Derek. I'm driving, so maybe a little bit slow. So I have a question about the AUV deployment. So the current site, the AUV being deployed once every couple of months by a ship leaving WHOI. What's the plan for the new site? And also the coverage. Currently it's going around one along shelf, one cross shelf. For the new site, how it's going to be deployed?
Both excellent questions, Gordon. And the short answer is we don't know yet. Those are the glider lines and the AUV, the sort of glider operations and AUV operations are among the things that we've pushed out a little bit to the future. We don't quite have, we're kind of, we're working on the mooring design, trying to get that solidified, and we're not quite at the point of doing the mobile asset implementation plan yet. So that'll come, and we'll try to answer, we'll try to get it. You bring up very good points, and we don't quite have the answers yet. But tell us what you think. I mean, we're open for input. If you have ideas, we're certainly going to lean, as we talked about, we're leaning heavily on the innovations lab, but that's not our only source of input. So if you have ideas, let us know.
Are you good, Gordon?
Yeah, thank you, Al.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands up, but we're certainly willing to entertain questions. We've left time here for that. I'll give 30 seconds to another brave soul. And other than that, Eric and Al certainly are open to suggestions and questions, so don't hesitate to get in touch with them. I don't see any others, so with that, thank you all. Al, that was a great presentation. Lisa, you always just frame things so excellently. Thank you. And Derek, you're always the person with answers. So thank you all. And we have a long road ahead. So we'll keep everyone on the line informed, and please provide your feedback to everyone. Thank you. Bye all.